The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the white tablecloth as Marcus raised his champagne flute, his voice carrying that practiced charm that had once made my heart flutter. "To 20 years," he announced to the elegant dining room filled with our closest friends. 20 years of building something extraordinary together. The applause rippled through the private dining room at Ashford's most exclusive restaurant, but his next words would shatter more than just my world. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Though I have to admit," he continued with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, "I'm ready for the next chapter. You know Vera's been an amazing housewife, but I want to live again. Really live." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of someone setting down their fork too hastily. 20 years, 7,300 days of waking up in our Ashford Heights mansion, of perfectly pressed shirts waiting in his closet, of dinner parties where I smiled and nodded while he held court about his latest real estate acquisition. 20 years of slowly disappearing until I became nothing more than the woman who made sure his world ran smoothly. I stared at Marcus across the table, watching him bask in the uncomfortable laughter of our guests, and felt something crack deep inside my chest. The careful foundation I'd built my identity upon crumbled with those casual, devastating words. "Vera's been an amazing housewife, but I want to live again." The phrase echoed in my mind as conversations awkwardly resumed around us. Patricia Whitman, my supposed best friend, leaned over with wide eyes and whispered, "Oh, honey, you know how men get about their midlife situations. He doesn't mean anything by it." But I could see the pity in her gaze, the same look she'd given me 3 months ago when Marcus had openly flirted with the 20-something hostess at the country club's charity gala. The same look everyone had been giving me for longer than I cared to acknowledge. Marcus continued his performance, regaling the table with stories of his upcoming solo trip to Monaco, his plans to buy a motorcycle, his desire to reconnect with who I really am. Each word felt like a scalpel, precisely cutting away the illusion that we were partners in this life we'd created. I was the backdrop, the supporting character in his grand narrative of success and sophistication. When dessert arrived, a towering chocolate creation I'd specifically requested from the chef weeks ago when planning this celebration, Marcus waved it away dismissively. "Actually, I'm trying to get back in shape. Vera, you understand." He patted his still flat stomach meaningfully. "Some of us want to stay attractive." The drive home passed in suffocating silence. Our Mercedes glided through the manicured streets of Ashford Heights, past houses where other couples were probably celebrating their own milestones with joy instead of humiliation. I watched the familiar landmarks blur past, the tennis club where I'd spent countless mornings playing doubles with women who tolerated me because of Marcus's business connections, the boutique where I bought the designer dress I was wearing, chosen specifically because Marcus had once complimented a similar style on a magazine cover. Everything in my life had been curated to please him, to reflect well on his image, to serve his ambitions. Inside our house, the silence became even more oppressive. Marcus headed straight to his study without a word, probably to call his business partner about the Monaco opportunity he'd mentioned at dinner. I stood in our grand foyer, surrounded by the trappings of what everyone would call a successful marriage. The marble floors gleamed, the fresh flowers I arranged twice weekly perfumed the air, and family photos in expensive frames lined the mahogany side table. But looking at those images now, Marcus's hand possessively on my shoulder at various charity events, both of us smiling those practiced social smiles, I saw the truth I'd been avoiding for years. I was a prop in his carefully constructed life. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept peacefully beside me, already mentally planning his escape from our marriage without the inconvenience of actually ending it. He wanted his freedom while keeping the comfortable foundation I provide, the perfectly managed household, the social connections I'd cultivated, the reputation we'd built together in Ashford's elite circles. He wanted to have his midlife adventure while I remained frozen in place, waiting for him to return when the excitement wore off. The revelation that had been building for months finally crystallized with painful clarity. I'd spent 2 decades becoming exactly what Marcus wanted, the perfect wife who anticipated his needs, managed his social calendar and never created complications or demands. I'd given up my dreams of opening my own catering business, dismissed my passion for culinary arts as a cute hobby when Marcus's career took off. I'd stopped seeing friends who didn't fit into his professional network, gradually narrowing my world until it revolved entirely around his comfort and success. But lying there in the dark, I realized something that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I didn't know who Vera Castellano was anymore. Somewhere in the process of becoming Mrs. Marcus Castellano, I'd lost myself so completely that I couldn't even remember what I'd wanted before I wanted to please him. The woman who'd graduated culinary school with honors, who'd dreamed of creating beautiful food that brought people together, who'd once been confident enough to travel solo through Europe for 3 months. Where had she gone? Morning brought fresh humiliation. Marcus emerged from his shower whistling, already dressed in his running gear. "I'm meeting Brad for a workout," he announced, checking his reflection in our bathroom mirror. "Then we're looking at that Harley dealership. You don't mind if I'm gone most of the day, do?" He didn't wait for an answer, already mentally gone. "Oh, and Patricia called while you were sleeping. Something about lunch plans. I told her you'd call back." The casual dismissal in his tone, as if my schedule was merely an extension of his convenience, sparked something dangerous in my chest. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk about last night." He paused in the doorway, his expression shifting to that patient look he used when I brought up topics he considered unimportant. "About what?" "The dinner was great. Everyone had a wonderful time, though next time maybe we could skip the chocolate dessert situation. You know how I feel about unnecessary calories, about what you said, about me being just a housewife, about wanting to live again." His laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Come on, Vera. Don't be so sensitive. Everyone knows what I meant. I'm 45 years old. I've built an empire and now I want to enjoy it. You should be happy for me." He stepped closer, his tone shifting to that patronizing gentleness that always preceded his manipulation. "Look, you've done an amazing job with the house, with entertaining, with all of that domestic stuff, but I need more excitement in my life now. I need to feel alive again." "And what about what I need?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise him. "What do you mean?" "You have everything you could want. This house, your allowance, complete freedom to pursue your little hobbies. Most women would kill for your life. My little hobby, 20 years of marriage." And he still couldn't acknowledge that my culinary skills had helped him secure some of his biggest business deals through the dinner parties I'd planned and executed flawlessly, the networking events where my carefully crafted menus had impressed potential investors, the charity fundraisers where my donated desserts had raised thousands of dollars for causes that enhanced his reputation in the community. "I want to work again," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I want to use my training, maybe start that catering business we used to talk about." His expression darkened immediately. "We've been over this, Vera. It would be a distraction from what really matters. My business requires a wife who's available, who can handle the social obligations, who understands that my career comes first. Besides, you haven't worked in 20 years. Who's going to take you seriously now?" The cruelty of that last comment hit like a physical blow. He was right, of course. I'd been out of the professional culinary world so long that my credentials were ancient history, but the dismissive way he said it, as if my dreams were ridiculous fantasies, ignited something I'd kept buried for far too long. "So I'm supposed to just wait here while you go live your life? You're supposed to support me, like you always have. That's what marriage is about." He checked his expensive watch, already moving toward the door. "Look, I don't have time for this drama right now. Brad's waiting, and I promised I'd be there by 8. We'll talk later." But we wouldn't talk later. We never really talked anymore. Marcus would disappear for the day, return with stories of his adventures, and expect me to listen with enthusiasm while he planned his next escape from our life together. The pattern had been building for months, but I'd chosen to ignore it, to convince myself that this was just a phase, that eventually he'd remember what we'd built together. Standing alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the high-end appliances I'd chosen, but rarely used for anything more elaborate than his morning coffee, I felt the last threads of my old life beginning to fray. The woman who'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of accommodation, who'd made Marcus's happiness her primary occupation, was finally ready to admit the truth. She was dying a slow death of incremental compromises and casual dismissal. I opened my laptop for the first time in weeks, my fingers hesitating over the keyboard. When had I stopped having my own email account, my own social media presence, my own connections to the outside world? Everything had been gradually absorbed into Marcus's orbit, until I existed only in relation to him. Mrs. Marcus Castellano, the perfect hostess, the supportive wife, the woman who made his success possible while remaining carefully invisible. But somewhere in the depths of my memory, buried under years of learned helplessness and willing self-erasure, was a different woman, a woman who'd once driven 12 hours straight to deliver a wedding cake when the original baker had a family emergency, who'd worked triple shifts at a restaurant in Boston to pay for advanced pastry classes, who'd won a regional competition for innovative dessert design before she'd ever met Marcus Castellano. That woman had dreams that extended beyond making other people comfortable. She had ambitions, creativity, and the kind of fierce independence that Marcus had spent 20 years systematically dismantling. The realization that I'd been complicit in my own diminishment was almost unbearable, but it was also the first step towards something I hadn't felt in decades, the possibility of change. I found myself researching culinary schools, reading about small business loans, exploring websites for commercial kitchen rentals. With each click, each possibility that opened before me, I felt a spark of something that had been dormant so long I'd forgotten its name. Not the desperate hope that Marcus would change, would remember how to value me, would suddenly see me as more than a convenient accessory to his life, but the radical hope that maybe it wasn't too late to remember who I'd been before I'd agreed to disappear. The irony wasn't lost on me. In his casual cruelty at our anniversary dinner, in his dismissive attitude toward my dreams, Marcus had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. He'd finally said out loud what I'd been feeling for years, but hadn't been brave enough to acknowledge. Our marriage was a beautiful prison, and I'd been both the captive and the warden. By the time Marcus returned that evening, full of excitement about the motorcycle he'd decided to purchase, and the guy's trip to Monaco he was planning for the following month, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I just didn't know yet how dramatically my life was about to transform, or how far I'd have to travel, both physically and emotionally, to find my way back to myself. That night, as Marcus fell asleep, planning his next adventure, I lay awake making plans of my own. Plans that didn't include waiting patiently for him to remember I existed. Plans that started with a simple, terrifying question: what would Vera Castellano want if she wasn't afraid of disappointing anyone else? The answer, when it finally came, would lead me further from home than I'd ever imagined possible, to a place where the scent of fresh bread and salt air would teach me everything I'd forgotten about the woman I used to be. 3 weeks passed before I found the courage to act on the plans I'd been secretly nurturing. Marcus had thrown himself into his midlife renaissance, with the enthusiasm of a man finally freed from pretense. The motorcycle sat gleaming in our garage, a chrome monument to his newfound liberation. He'd joined an exclusive fitness club where divorced executives and young professionals mingled over protein shakes and ambition. His wardrobe had undergone a complete transformation, traded businessman conservative for carefully curated casual that screamed expensive rebellion. The worst part wasn't his obvious pursuit of a younger version of himself. It was his complete obliviousness to my growing distance from our shared life. When I stopped asking about his plans, he didn't notice. When I began eating dinner alone while he attended networking events that sounded suspiciously like dates, he expressed relief that I was finally giving him space to breathe. My silence, which had once been a source of comfort to him, now became permission for his emotional abandon. I'd started small, testing the boundaries of my carefully constructed cage. A solo trip to the farmer's market where I talked to vendors about their seasonal ingredients instead of rushing through my shopping list. An afternoon, spent in the public library researching small business regulations, hunched over a computer terminal like a teenager hiding contraband. Each tiny act of independence felt both thrilling and terrifying, as if I were learning to walk again after decades of voluntary paralysis. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning that began like countless others. Marcus emerged from his shower already dressed for another day of pursuing his authentic self, this time in the form of rock climbing lessons with his trainer, a 28-year-old named Skylar who posted inspirational quotes about living your truth on social media. I was sitting at our kitchen island, laptop open, reviewing information about commercial kitchen rentals in nearby towns. "Still playing around with that cooking thing?" he asked, grabbing a protein bar from the pantry. His tone held the same indulgent patience he might use with a child insisting they wanted to be an astronaut. "You know, there's a new personal trainer at the club who specializes in women our age. Maybe it's time to think about getting yourself in shape instead of fantasizing about careers that aren't realistic." Women our age. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. At 42, I was apparently past the point of new beginnings, relegated to the category of women who should focus on maintenance rather than growth. The casual cruelty of it, delivered while he planned another adventure with someone young enough to be our daughter, finally shattered whatever remained of my tolerance for his selfishness. "I'm leaving," I said quietly, the words surprising even me with their clarity. Marcus paused in unwrapping his breakfast, his expression shifting from distraction to mild annoyance. "Leaving for where? Do we have some social obligation I forgot about?" "Leaving you, leaving this house, leaving this life." The protein bar dropped to the counter as he turned to face me fully, his carefully cultivated tan suddenly looking artificial under the kitchen's bright lights. "What are you talking about? Is this about the other night? Because I thought we agreed that you were being overly sensitive about a joke." "It wasn't a joke, Marcus, and this isn't about one night. This is about 20 years of becoming smaller and smaller until I completely disappear." I closed the laptop, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. "I'm going away for a while to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be who you need me to be." His laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Going away where? You don't have anywhere to go. You don't have friends outside our circle. You don't have money of your own. You haven't worked in 2 decades. This is your life, Vera, this house, our marriage, the position you have in this community. You can't just walk away from reality because you're having some kind of emotional crisis." Each word was calculated to reinforce the prison he'd helped me build, but instead of the familiar fear and doubt, I felt something unexpected rising in my chest. Clarity, cold, clean clarity about exactly how thoroughly he'd isolated me from any possibility of independence. The realization that this conversation was proof of everything wrong with our marriage gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. "You're right," I said, standing up from the stool. "I don't have much, but I have my grandmother's inheritance that you never wanted to touch, because it wasn't substantial enough to matter to your investments, and I have my car that's titled in my name, and I have 20 years of experience managing complex households and events that taught me more about business than you give me credit for." His expression shifted to something I'd rarely seen from him, genuine alarm. "You're being ridiculous. Where exactly do you think you're going to go? What are you going to do? You're talking about throwing away everything we've built together for some fantasy about independence. I'm talking about finding out what I might have built if I hadn't spent 20 years building your dreams instead of my own." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen where I'd been researching small coastal towns in Maine, places far enough from Ashford Heights to be free from the suffocating expectations of our social circle. "I'm going to Port Evangel. There's a small cottage available for rent, and it's beautiful there, and quiet, and I can think." Marcus stared at the phone as if it were a weapon pointed at his chest. "Port Evangeline? That's some tiny fishing village in the middle of nowhere. What could you possibly want with a place like that? Peace, space to remember what I used to want before I learned to want only what made you happy." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, amazed at how calm I felt. "I've already put a deposit down on the cottage. I'm leaving this afternoon." The transformation in his demeanor was swift and familiar. The indulgent patience evaporated, replaced by the cold calculation he used in business negotiations when someone dared to challenge his authority. "Fine, go have your little breakdown in Maine, but understand something, Vera. When you come crawling back in a few weeks, broke and humiliated, things are going to be different between us. I won't be as understanding about this childish rebellion as I'm being now. I'm not planning to come crawling back. We'll see about that." He grabbed his keys from the counter, his movement sharp with anger. "Don't expect me to subsidize this fantasy. If you want to abandon your responsibilities here, you can figure out how to support yourself. See how long your grandmother's money lasts when you're trying to survive in the real world." After he stormed out, probably to call his business partner and complain about his irrational wife. I sat in the sudden silence of our kitchen and marveled at how different the house felt without his oppressive presence. The carefully curated perfection that had once been my pride now looked like a museum exhibit, beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of life. I walked through rooms I'd decorated to his exacting standards, past furniture chosen for its impressiveness rather than comfort, and felt like a stranger touring someone else's life. Packing proved simpler than I'd expected. 20 years of marriage had left me with surprisingly few possessions that felt genuinely mine. The designer clothes Marcus had selected for me hung in the closet like costumes for a play I no longer wanted to perform. The jewelry he'd given me for anniversaries and birthdays sparkled with memories of obligation rather than joy. In the end, I filled 2 suitcases with practical clothes, my grandmother's recipe collection, and a few photographs from before my marriage when my smile looked genuine and unstable. The drive to Maine stretched before me like a bridge to an unknown country. I'd plotted the route carefully, choosing scenic highways over interstates, allowing myself time to decompress from the intensity of finally breaking free. As Ashford Heights disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for what came next instead of dread about disappointing someone with my choices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Port Evangeline revealed itself gradually as the coastal highway curved around a series of rocky promontories. Weathered fishing boats bobbed in the protected harbor while seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries mingling with the distant sound of waves against granite cliffs. The town itself was everything Ashford Heights was not: unpretentious, weathered by salt air and honest work, beautiful in ways that couldn't be purchased or managed into existence. Tidewater Cottage sat on a bluff overlooking the harbor, a small Cape Cod-style house that had been lovingly maintained, but never modernized beyond necessity. The rental agent, a cheerful woman named Ruth who'd lived in Port Evangeline her entire life, walked me through rooms that smelled of sea air and wood smoke from countless winter fires. Previous tenant was an artist from Boston, she explained, pointing out the easel and art supplies left behind in the sunroom. Stayed 3 years before she decided to move somewhere warmer. Hope you'll be happier here than she was with our winters. 3 years. The possibility of staying anywhere for 3 years, of putting down roots again, seemed both impossible and essential. Standing in the cottage's small kitchen, looking out at the harbor through windows that needed no designer treatments to frame their view, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: the desire to make a place truly my own. That first night, I sat on the cottage's small deck wrapped in a blanket I'd found in the linen closet, listening to the sound of waves against the rocks below. The silence was profound in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of noise. It was the silence of not having to anticipate someone else's needs, not having to monitor my words and actions for potential criticism, not having to perform the careful dance of accommodation that had become my default mode of existence. I called my sister Rebecca in California, the only family member I'd maintained regular contact with, despite Marcus's subtle discouragement of relationships that didn't serve his social or business interests. "I've left Marcus," I told her without preamble, watching the lights of fishing boats heading out for the night's work. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Rebecca's voice came through, careful and concerned. "Left him how? Are you okay? Are you safe?" "I'm in Maine, in a cottage by the sea, and I'm okay. Actually, I think I'm better than okay for the first time in years." "Vera, honey, what happened? Did he hurt you? Do you need me to come out there?" The concern in her voice brought unexpected tears. When had I stopped having people in my life who worried about my well-being rather than my usefulness? He didn't hurt me physically, but he's been hurting me in other ways for so long that I stopped noticing it was happening. "Rebecca, I don't even know who I am anymore. I've spent so many years being who he needed me to be, that I lost myself completely." "I know," she said quietly. "I've been watching it happen for years and not knowing how to help. You stopped returning my calls about anything real. Every conversation became about Marcus's achievements, or your social obligations. I missed my sister," Her words cut deeper than any of Marcus's casual cruelties because they came from love rather than manipulation. I'd abandoned myself so thoroughly that I'd also abandoned everyone who might have reminded me of who I used to be. I'm going to figure out how to find her again, the woman I was before I decided that making Marcus happy was more important than making myself happy. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, but for the first time in 20 years that feels like possibility instead of panic. We talked for another hour. Her voice, a lifeline connecting me to the woman I'd been before marriage, convinced me that my dreams were selfish luxury. She reminded me of stories I'd forgotten, the elaborate birthday cakes I'd made for her children, the dinner party I'd catered for her promotion celebration, the way I used to light up when talking about food and flavors and the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into something memorable. After we hung up, I sat in the cottage's small living room and opened my grandmother's recipe collection for the first time in years. Her careful handwriting filled the margins with notes about adjustments and variations, stories about which dishes had been family favorites, and which had been experiments worth trying again. Nona had run a small bakery in Boston's North End until she was 75, known throughout the neighborhood for bread that drew lines down the block every morning. I'd spent summers with her as a child, standing on a step stool beside her commercial mixer, learning to read dough by touch and to judge doneness by smell rather than timers. She'd taught me that cooking was an act of love, but also an act of creativity and independence. A woman who can feed people well, she used to say, never has to depend on anyone else for her security. At the time I'd thought she was talking about the practical aspects of cooking. Now I understood she meant something deeper, the confidence that comes from possessing skills people value, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and necessary with your own hands, the independence that grows from knowing you can take care of yourself and others. That night I made my first meal in the cottage's simple kitchen. Nothing elaborate, just pasta with olive oil and herbs from the small garden the previous tenant had left behind. But eating food I'd prepared for my own pleasure, seasoned to my own taste, felt like a radical act after years of cooking to Marcus's preferences and dietary restrictions. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. Over the following days, I established routines that belonged entirely to me. Morning walks along the harbor where lobster boats unloaded their catch while the town slowly came to life. Afternoons exploring Port Evangeline's small downtown, discovering shops and cafes that had clearly served the same families for generations. Evenings on the cottage deck, reading books I'd chosen for my own interest rather than to impress anyone at dinner party. The town's rhythm was completely different from Ashford Heights' frantic pursuit of achievement and status. Here, success seemed measured in different terms: the respect of neighbors who'd known you for decades, the satisfaction of work that served an essential purpose, the pleasure of simple traditions that connected past and present. Watching the daily interactions between longtime residents, I realized I'd been living in a community that was all surface and no substance, where relationships existed to serve ambition rather than to provide genuine connection. But it was the discovery of La Lune Bakery that changed everything. Tucked between a hardware store and a bookshop on Port Evangeline's main street, the small storefront drew me with the scent of fresh bread and the warmth of its golden light spilling onto the sidewalk. Through the window I watched a woman about my age moving with practiced efficiency between ovens and work surfaces, her graying hair contained in a neat bun, her movements, speaking of decades of experience and genuine passion for her craft. The display case held an assortment of breads and pastries that made my heart ache with recognition and longing. Crusty baguettes that would have made my grandmother proud, croissants with the perfect layers that spoke of hours of careful preparation, fruit tarts that looked like edible jewels. This was the kind of food I'd dreamed of creating when I was young and believed that passion could be enough to build a life upon. Standing outside that bakery window watching a woman who'd clearly found a way to make her living from work that fulfilled her soul, I felt the first stirring of something I'd thought was dead forever. Ambition that had nothing to do with pleasing anyone else, and everything to do with reclaiming the person I'd been before I learned to be afraid of my own dream. The bell above La Lune Bakery's door chimed softly as I finally gathered the courage to step inside. 3 days after first discovering the shop, the interior was even more enchanting than I'd imagined, with exposed brick walls displaying vintage French advertisements, and wooden shelves lined with ceramic crocks and copper molds. The scent of yeast and butter created an atmosphere so rich it felt almost edible. Behind the counter stood the woman I'd been watching through the window, her eyes the color of sea glass and her smile genuinely welcoming rather than professionally polite. She wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron before greeting me in accented English that carried the musical cadence of southwestern France. Bonjour! Welcome to La Lune. You are new to Port Evangeline. Yes, I am Delphine Moreau. Her directness was refreshing after years of Ashford Heights social dancing, where conversations required careful navigation through layers of subtext and competition. Vera Castellano, I'm renting Tidewater Cottage for a while. The admission felt strange, as if I were trying on a new identity that didn't quite fit yet. For 20 years I'd introduced myself as Marcus Castellano's wife first, my own identity always secondary to his prominence. Ah, the artist cottage, beautiful view, not. Henry and I, we often walk past on our evening stroll and admire the sunset from your bluff. She gestured toward the back of the shop where I caught a glimpse of a man with silver hair carefully shaping dough at a marble work surface. My husband. He is the bread maker. I handle the pastries and the business. Together, we are complete. The easy partnership she described with such warmth struck me like a physical blow. This was what marriage could look like when both people contributed their strengths without one diminishing the other. I watched Henry work for a moment, noting how he handled the dough with reverence rather than mere efficiency, and felt a pang of loss for something I'd never actually experienced. Your pastries are beautiful, I managed, studying the display case to avoid Delphine's perceptive gaze. That tarte aux poires looks exactly like something my grandmother used to make. Vraiment? Your grandmother? She was French? Italian, but she spent time in France as a young woman. She had a bakery in Boston's North End for almost 50 years. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, carrying with them memories I'd kept carefully buried. She taught me to bake when I was little, but I haven't done any serious cooking in years. Delphine's expression shifted to something that looked almost maternal. Cooking? It is like riding the bicycle. Yes, the hands remember even when the mind forgets. What brings you to our little town, if you don't mind my asking? The question I'd been dreading since arriving in Port Evangeline hung in the air between us. How could I explain that I'd fled my marriage not because of dramatic abuse or infidelity, but because I'd slowly suffocated under the weight of my own accommodating nature? That I'd come here to remember who I was before I decided that being loved meant erasing myself. I needed to get away from my life for a while, I said finally, to figure some things out. Delphine nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes the heart needs space to breathe, like bread needs time to rise. You are welcome here whenever you need company or just good coffee. We open at 6 each morning, if you are an early person. I purchased a small loaf of Henri's sourdough and one of Delphine's apple turnovers, planning to take them back to the cottage for a quiet lunch. But as I reached the door, Delphine called out softly, Vera, tomorrow is Sunday, our day for experiments. Henri and I, we try new recipes, practice techniques we haven't used in years. If you would like to join us, to remember what your hands know about baking, you are welcome. The invitation was so unexpected and generous that tears pricked my eyes. I wouldn't want to impose. I'm sure you value your time together. Cooking is always better with 3 sets of hands. Besides, she smiled, it has been too long since we had a student. Teaching reminds us why we fell in love with this work in the first place. That evening, I called Rebecca again, needing to share this unexpected development with someone who would understand its significance. A French bakery, she laughed when I described my encounter with Delphine. Vera, you realize this sounds like something out of one of those novels where the heroine discovers herself through the magic of butter and flour, right? I know it sounds ridiculous, but Rebecca, you should have seen how she and her husband work together. They've created this beautiful life where their individual talents complement each other instead of competing. It's everything I thought marriage should be. And you're going to bake with them tomorrow? I think so. I'm terrified I'll make a fool of myself. It's been so long since I did anything more complicated than reheating Marcus's preferred frozen dinners. Vera, you used to make wedding cakes that were works of art. You catered my college graduation party for 30 people and made it look effortless. The skills are still there, buried under years of convincing yourself that Marcus's needs were more important than your talents. Her confidence in me felt like armor against my own doubts. That night, I read through Nana's recipes until well past midnight. My grandmother's marginalia bringing back sense memories of her kitchen, the way she tested oil temperature with a wooden spoon, how she knew bread was done by the sound it made when tapped, her insistence that every good cook needed to taste constantly and adjust fearlessly. Sunday morning dawned gray and misty, typical October weather for coastal Maine. I arrived at La Lune carrying a container of Nana's anise cookies, a peace offering that felt inadequate but sincere. Delphine greeted me at the back entrance, already dressed in a flour-dusted apron, her hair twisted up in a practical chignon. Perfect timing. Henri has just started the brioche dough, and I am preparing to make croissants. We thought you might enjoy learning our method for puff pastry. It is meditation in motion, very soothing for troubled hearts. The bakery's kitchen was larger than I'd expected, with professional-grade ovens and mixers alongside handcrafted wooden tools that looked like family heirlooms. Henri looked up from his work to offer a shy smile and a few words in French that Delphine translated as appreciation for my grandmother's cookies. He says they taste like memories, she explained, breaking off a piece to savor. This is high praise from a man who grew up in his own grandmother's patisserie in Provence. Watching them work together was like observing a carefully choreographed dance performed by partners who'd been perfecting their steps for decades. Henri's movements were economical and precise, his focus absolute as he kneaded brioche dough to silk-smooth perfection. Delphine approached her croissant preparation with artistic flair, rolling butter between sheets of parchment with practiced rhythm while explaining the temperature requirements that made the difference between success and failure. The butter she must be pliable but not soft, Delphine instructed, demonstrating the technique that would create the flaky layers essential to proper croissants. Like a good marriage, yes, flexible enough to blend but strong enough to maintain its own character. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. In my marriage to Marcus, I'd become the soft butter, losing all definition under pressure. Here in this kitchen, watching Delphine coax perfect pastry from simple ingredients through patience and skill, I began to understand what I'd sacrificed in my eagerness to please. They set me to work on a simple pain de campagne, a country bread that would forgive mistakes while teaching fundamental technique. As my hands rediscovered the feel of properly hydrated dough, the subtle resistance that indicated adequate gluten development, something deep inside me began to uncoil. This was what I'd missed during my years of learned helplessness, the satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful through my own effort and knowledge. You have good instincts, Henri observed in careful English, watching me shape the loaf. Your hands know the dough, even after long absence. His approval warmed me more than any compliment Marcus had ever paid about my appearance or social performance. This was recognition of actual skill, acknowledgement of knowledge I'd earned through practice and passion rather than inherited through marriage. As the morning progressed, Delphine shared stories of her journey from corporate marketing in Leanne to artisan baking in coastal Maine. I was successful, you understand, but success that requires you to ignore your true nature is not sustainable. Henri and we met when I was consulting for his restaurant. He saw that I was miserable despite my achievements, and he suggested I try working with my hands instead of just my mind. Wasn't it frightening to start over? I asked, punching down my risen dough with more force than necessary, working out frustrations I hadn't fully acknowledged. Terrifying, she admitted, beginning to roll out croissant dough with meditative precision. I was 38 with a mortgage and a reputation and all the things that make change seem impossible. But staying where I was felt like slow death. Sometimes fear of suffocation is stronger than fear of drowning. Her words resonated so deeply I had to pause in my kneading. Slow death. That perfectly described what I'd been experiencing in Ashford Heights, the gradual dimming of everything that had once made me feel alive. Marcus hadn't been actively malicious. He'd simply been so focused on his own needs and ambitions that he'd never noticed I was disappearing. "How did you know this was right?" I gestured around the kitchen where the three of us worked in comfortable synchronization. "How did you know you wouldn't fail?" "I didn't know," Delphine replied simply, "but I knew that failing at something I cared about was better than succeeding at something that made me feel empty. And I had Henri, who believed in my dreams even when I doubted them myself." Henri looked up from shaping baguettes to smile at his wife with such genuine affection that I felt a stab of envy. Not for their specific relationship, but for the possibility it represented. Partnership based on mutual respect and support rather than one person's accommodation of the other's ego. By afternoon, the kitchen was filled with the results of our collaboration. My country bread had emerged from the oven with a crisp crust and open crumb that would have made Nana proud. Delphine's croissants were architectural marvels of buttery layers, and Henri's baguettes displayed the perfect ear that marked truly artisanal bread. "You should take some home," Delphine insisted, wrapping my loaves in clean linen towels. "And Vera, you have talent that deserves to be nurtured. If you would like to continue learning while you're here, we would be honored to teach you." The offer was so generous, it took my breath away. In Ashford Heights, relationships came with calculations and expectations, social exchanges that required careful balance of obligation and advantage. Here was simple human kindness offered to a stranger who'd stumbled into their world. "I couldn't possibly impose on your business. You're trying to make a living, not run a cooking school." "Who says we cannot do both?" Henri interjected, his English improving with his comfort level. "Students, they bring new energy, new questions that make us think differently about old methods. Besides, Delphine is right. You have the hands of a baker. It would be waste to leave such talent sleeping." Walking back to Tidewater Cottage with my arms full of fresh bread, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in my own accomplishment. Not pride in reflecting well on someone else or successfully managing their social obligations, but genuine satisfaction in skills I'd developed and deployed successfully. That evening I sat on the cottage deck with a glass of wine and a thick slice of my own bread, watching fishing boats return to harbor as the sun set over Port Evangel. The simple meal tasted better than any of the elaborate restaurant dinners Marcus had favored, partly because of the bread's honest flavor, but mostly because it represented something I'd created for my own pleasure. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, the first communication since I'd left Ashford Heights 2 weeks earlier. "Hope you're enjoying your little vacation. Patricia says to tell you she's available whenever you're ready to talk sense. The house feels empty without your touch. Missing you." The message was carefully crafted to sound loving while reinforcing his conviction that my departure was temporary, a tantrum that would run its course once I'd proven to myself that I couldn't survive without his support. There was no acknowledgement of the problems in our marriage, no indication that he'd used my absence for self-reflection, no genuine curiosity about what I might be discovering during my time away. I deleted the message without responding and called Rebecca instead. "I baked bread today," I told her without preamble. "Real bread, from scratch, with a French couple who owns a bakery here. And Rebecca, I was good at it. I remembered how to judge the dough by feel, how to shape loaves properly. My hands knew what to do even though my mind was convinced I'd forgotten everything." "Of course you were good at it. You're a trained chef, Vera. Just because you put your career aside for Marcus doesn't mean the knowledge disappeared." "I think I want to stay here longer than I originally planned, maybe much longer." The silence on the other end of the line stretched just long enough to make me wonder if I'd shocked her with the admission. Finally Rebecca spoke, her voice careful but supportive. "What would longer mean? Are you thinking about divorce?" The word hung between us like a bridge I hadn't quite worked up the courage to cross. Divorce meant admitting that 20 years of my life had been built on a foundation that couldn't support who I was becoming. It meant accepting that love without respect wasn't actually love at all. I don't know yet. But I know I can't go back to being the woman who disappeared herself to keep Marcus comfortable, whether that means working on our marriage or ending it. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not performing the role of the perfect wife. And you think you can figure that out in a small town in Maine? I looked around the cottage that had begun to feel more like home than the mansion I'd left behind. I think I can figure it out anywhere I'm allowed to be myself without apology. Port Evangeline just happens to be where I landed. Over the following weeks, I fell into a routine that felt more natural than anything I'd experienced in years. Mornings at La Lune, learning everything Delphine and Henri were willing to teach about the ancient alchemy of flour, water, and time. Afternoons exploring the coastal trails that threaded through spruce forests and emerged onto rocky promontories with views that made my chest ache with unexpected beauty. Evenings in the cottage, reading cookbooks I'd borrowed from the library and planning modifications to recipes that had captured my imagination. Delphine proved to be an intuitive teacher who understood that my hands needed to relearn confidence before my mind could process complex techniques. She started me with simple yeasted breads before progressing to the more demanding world of laminated doughs and delicate pastries. Each success built upon the last, creating a foundation of competence that felt unshakable because it belonged entirely to me. Henri, initially shy about his English, gradually opened up as we worked side by side at the marble pastry table. His approach to bread making was both scientific and mystical, grounded in understanding the biology of fermentation while remaining open to the intuitive adjustments that separated good bakers from great ones. "Bread, she will teach you patience if you let her," he explained one morning, as we waited for sourdough starter to reach peak activity. "Cannot rush the natural process, cannot force the timing. Must learn to work with nature instead of against her." His philosophy extended beyond baking into a worldview that emphasized cooperation over control, patience over urgency, quality over quantity. Everything Marcus's approach to life was not. The town itself embraced me gradually but genuinely. Ruth, my landlord, began stopping by the cottage for coffee and conversation about local history. Isadora Blackwood, whose pottery studio occupied the storefront next to La Lune, invited me to join her Wednesday evening drawing group where local artists gathered to sketch and share wine and story. Even Bastien Leclerc, who owned the Weathered Anchor Tavern, started greeting me by name when I stopped in for the occasional dinner. These connections felt different from the social networks I'd navigated in Ashford Heights. Here relationships developed organically around shared interests and mutual respect rather than strategic advantage. People cared about my thoughts on sourdough hydration ratios and my progress with croissant technique, not my husband's business success or my value as a social asset. 6 weeks into my stay, Delphine approached me with a proposal that would change everything. "Henri and we have been discussing something," she began as we cleaned the bakery after a busy Saturday morning. "The Christmas season, it is our busiest time. Many special orders for holiday breads and pastries. We could use help, someone with skills and passion for the work." I paused in wiping down the marble work surface, hardly daring to hope I understood what she was suggesting. "You mean temporary help? For the holiday?" "I mean partnership, if you are interested. Not as owners, you understand, but as collaborator. Someone who contributes knowledge and effort and receives fair compensation for her work." Delphine's expression was serious but kind. "We have watched you you have talent, yes, but more importantly, you have the heart for this work. You understand that feeding people well is both craft and calling." The offer was so unexpected and generous that I felt dizzy with possibility. Real work, using skills I'd thought were lost forever. Partnership with people who valued my contributions rather than my compliance. The chance to earn my own money doing something that filled me with purpose instead of draining my spirit. "I would love that more than I can express," I managed. "But I should tell you I'm married. My situation is complicated. I don't know how long I can stay in Port Evangeline." Henri looked up from the sourdough starter he was feeding, his expression gentle but firm. "Marriage that requires you to hide your talents is not marriage. Is prison. You stay as long as you need. Work as long as you can contribute. We make no demands on your future, only invitation to your present." That night I sat at the cottage's small kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at a blank email addressed to Mark. How could I explain that I'd found work that mattered to me? People who saw my value, a life that felt authentic in ways our marriage never had. How could I make him understand that this wasn't rebellion but rediscovery? In the end, I wrote simply, "I've found work in Port Evangeline that uses my culinary training. I'm not sure when I'll be coming home. We need to talk seriously about our marriage when I do. I hope you're well. His response came within hours, predictably dismissive. Glad you're keeping busy with your hobbies. Take all the time you need to get this out of your system. The house will be here when you're ready to come back to reality. Even now, even after I'd proven I could survive and thrive without his support, he couldn't acknowledge that my work might have value beyond personal entertainment. The casual dismissal that had once reduced me to tears now simply reinforced my growing certainty that our marriage was built on fundamentally incompatible visions of partnership. I closed the laptop and walked out onto the cottage deck, breathing in the salt air that had become as essential to me as oxygen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges at the bakery, new techniques to master, new ways to prove to myself that I was capable of far more than I'd allowed myself to believe during my years of willing diminishment. For the first time since leaving Ashford Heights, I wasn't just surviving my escape from Marcus's suffocating expectations. I was building something new, something that belonged entirely to me. And it felt like coming alive after a very long sleep. Winter arrived in Port Evangeline with the fierce beauty that defined coastal Maine, transforming the harbor town into something from a maritime fairy tale. Snow dusted the weathered shingles of century-old houses while ice crystals formed delicate patterns on bakery windows. The work at La Lune intensified as the holiday season approached, bringing orders for traditional Christmas breads, elaborate wedding cakes for winter ceremonies, and specialty pastries that required techniques I was still mastering. My hands had developed the calluses and strength that marked serious bakers, and my confidence grew with each successful batch of croissants, each perfectly risen loaf of pain de campagne. Delphine and Henri treated me as a true collaborator, seeking my input on flavor combinations, and trusting me with increasingly complex preparations. The financial independence was modest but meaningful, the first money I'd earned in my own name since before my marriage. The cottage had transformed under my care from a temporary refuge into something approaching home. I'd added touches that reflected my personality rather than someone else's expectations. Colorful pottery from Isadora's studio, cookbooks arranged on every available surface, herbs growing in mason jars on the windowsills. Despite the harsh weather, the space felt alive in ways my Ashford Heights mansion never had, infused with the energy of daily creativity and genuine contentment. Marcus's communications had dwindled to occasional texts that alternated between wounded confusion and subtle manipulation. "The neighbors are asking about you," arrived one gray December morning. "Patricia says you're having some kind of breakdown. Don't you think this has gone on long enough?" Another, a week later, "I've been doing some thinking. When you come home, we can redecorate the kitchen however you want. Maybe get you some of those professional appliances you used to talk about." Each message revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood my absence. He still believed this was about wanting different things within our existing framework rather than questioning the framework itself. The offer to redecorate the kitchen was particularly telling. He thought he could solve my dissatisfaction by giving me a prettier stage on which to perform the same supporting role. I'd stopped responding to most of his messages, but when he sent a photo of the empty house decorated for Christmas with the caption, "Looks lonely without your touch," I finally called him directly. "Marcus, we need to talk honestly about what's happening here." His relief was audible through the phone. "Vera, thank God. I was starting to worry that you'd really lost perspective on what matters. When are you coming home? Christmas is in 2 weeks, and Patricia's been planning that party we host every year." "I'm not coming home for Christmas. I'm working here, Marcus. I have responsibilities to people who depend on me." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge I recognized from his business negotiations when someone had pushed him too far. "Responsibilities? To strangers in some backwater town. Vera, you have responsibilities here. To me, to our marriage, to the life we've built together. I've been patient with this phase of yours, but it's time to stop playing games and come home. This isn't a game. I've found work that fulfills me, people who value my contributions, a community where I feel like I belong. I've remembered who I am when I'm not constantly trying to be who you need me to be." "You're talking nonsense. You belong here, with me, in the life we've created together. Whatever fantasy you're living up there isn't sustainable. You can't just abandon 20 years of marriage because you're going through some kind of midlife crisis. His dismissal of my growth as fantasy and crisis sparked anger I'd been keeping carefully controlled. Midlife crisis. Marcus, I've spent 20 years disappearing myself to make you comfortable. I stopped working, stopped seeing friends you didn't approve of, stopped having opinions that might conflict with yours. I became so good at anticipating your needs that I forgot I had any of my own. That's what marriage is, Vera. Compromise, partnership, putting the relationship first instead of indulging every selfish impulse. Partnership means both people contribute and both people matter. What we had was me organizing my entire existence around your comfort while you pursued whatever interested you without considering how it affected me. His laugh was sharp and ugly. Right, because providing for you, giving you a beautiful home and financial security, allowing you complete freedom to pursue your hobbies, that was all about my comfort. Allowing me. The phrase crystallized everything wrong with our relationship. In Marcus's mind, my freedom was something he granted rather than something I possessed inherently. My interests were hobbies to be tolerated rather than passions to be supported. My value existed in relation to his needs, rather than as an independent person worthy of respect. I want a divorce, Marcus. The words escaped before I'd consciously decided to speak them, but they felt true the moment they left my mouth. Not impulsive or angry, but inevitable as winter following autumn. The silence this time was profound, filled with the weight of 20 years crumbling into irretrievable pieces. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was cold and calculating in ways that reminded me why he'd been so successful in business. You want a divorce, over what exactly? Because I made a joke at our anniversary dinner, because I wanted to enjoy my success instead of pretending we're still struggling newlyweds. You're going to throw away everything we've built because you've decided that playing baker in some fishing village is more important than our marriage. I'm going to end a marriage that required me to become smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared completely. Marcus, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted? When did you last consider whether I was happy? When did you ever treat my dreams as anything more than cute diversion? Your dreams, Vera, be realistic. You're 42 years old, you haven't worked in the food industry in 20 years. This little baking adventure you're on isn't a career, it's an expensive hobby funded by the security I've provided. How long do you think you can sustain this fantasy without the foundation of our marriage supporting you? His words were designed to trigger the fear and self-doubt he'd cultivated in me for decades, but they landed differently now. Months of earning my own money, of having my skills valued and my contributions recognized, had built armor against his casual cruelty. I've been supporting myself here for months, Marcus, working 6 days a week, learning new techniques, contributing to a business that actually needs what I can offer. This isn't fantasy, it's the most real thing I've done in 20 years. Fine, have your breakdown, play house in your little coastal town, but don't expect me to finance this indefinitely. I'm cutting off your credit cards and the allowance. Let's see how long your independence lasts when you have to actually pay for it yourself. The threat that would have terrified me 6 months earlier now felt like liberation. Good. I don't want your money anymore. I want to earn my own living doing work that matters to me. We'll see about that. I'm coming to get you, Vera. This ridiculous charade has gone on long enough. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in the cottage's sudden silence. Marcus was coming to Port Evangeline, armed with 20 years of practiced manipulation and absolute conviction that I was too weak and foolish to survive without his guidance. The prospect should have filled me with dread, but instead I felt something unexpected, eager anticipation for him to meet the woman I'd become. I called Delphine immediately, needing to warn her that my complicated personal situation was about to spill into the peaceful world we'd created together. Mon Dieu, she breathed when I explained the situation. He sounds like a man who has never been told non by someone he considers his possession. But Vera, you are not the same woman who left him. Yes, you have strength now, independence, people who believe in your worth. He cannot take that away unless you let him. Her confidence bolstered my own, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that Marcus's arrival would shatter the fragile new life I'd built. He had a gift for making people see situations from his perspective, for framing my needs as selfish demands and his control as generous provision. What if the people of Port Evangeline, hearing his version of our marriage, concluded that I was an ungrateful wife abandoning her responsibilities? When does he arrive? Henri asked when Delphine shared the news with him. He didn't say. Probably this weekend, knowing Mark. He likes to make grand gestures when he's trying to regain control of a situation. Henri nodded thoughtfully, his weathered hands never pausing in their rhythmic kneading of tomorrow's bread. Then we prepare, not for battle, but for you show him the woman you have become, the work you do, the life you have built. If he cannot see your worth, that is blindness, not wisdom. Their support meant everything, but I knew the confrontation with Marcus would ultimately be mine to navigate. Friday evening, I stood in the cottage kitchen preparing dinner for one and trying to imagine how our conversation would unfold. Would he attempt charm first, appealing to our shared history and the comfort of familiar routine, or would he lead with threats, reminding me of my financial dependence and social isolation? The knock on my door came Saturday morning while I was reviewing inventory lists for La Lune's holiday order. Through the window I saw Marcus standing on the cottage porch, looking dramatically out of place in his designer wool coat and polished leather shoes. He'd driven his BMW, which sat gleaming and incongruous beside the weathered pickup trucks that belonged to my neighbor. I opened the door and felt the shock of seeing him again after months of absence. He looked exactly the same, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, radiating the confident authority that had once made me feel protected, but now seemed merely arrogant. But his expression when he saw me revealed his own surprise at my transformation. The woman he'd left behind in Ashford Heights had been soft in all the ways he preferred, physically, emotionally, mentally pliable to his wishes. The woman standing before him now carried herself differently. Months of physical work had given me muscle definition and calloused hands that spoke of useful labor. My hair, freed from expensive styling, caught the morning light in ways that made me look younger despite the silver threads that had emerged. My clothes were practical rather than decorative, chosen for comfort and function rather than to reflect his status. My God, Vera, what have you done to yourself? The question emerged before he could deploy his planned approach, revealing genuine shock at my physical transformation. I've remembered what it feels like to be strong, I replied, stepping aside to let him enter the cottage. Come in, we have a lot to discuss. He moved through the small space with obvious distaste, his gaze cataloging the simple furnishings and functional decor that had replaced the designer perfection of our former home. This is where you've been living, Vera? It's practically poverty compared to what we had together. It's home, the first place that's felt like home in 20 years. Marcus settled onto the cottage's modest sofa with the air of a man making dramatic concessions to unfortunate circumstances. Look, I understand that you needed some time to work through whatever issues you've been having. The counselor I consulted said that women our age sometimes experience hormonal disruptions that can cause irrational decision-making. But this has gone far enough. It's time to come home and rebuild what we had together. The casual dismissal of my transformation as hormonal imbalance was so typical of his approach that I almost laughed. Marcus, this isn't about hormones or temporary disruption. This is about finally admitting that our marriage was built on me disappearing myself to make you comfortable. That's not true and you know it. We had a good marriage, Vera. Financial security, social standing, mutual respect. I never asked you to disappear. I asked you to be a partner in building something significant together. You asked me to be a supporting character in your life story. There's a difference. He leaned forward, deploying the intense attention that had once made me feel special but now felt manipulative. Tell me what you want, Vera. Really want? A bigger role in the business? Your own project to manage? I'm listening. The offer was exactly what he would have proposed 20 years earlier, and exactly what would have satisfied me then. But sitting in my cottage kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my own capability and independence, I could see how his solutions still centered entirely on his world, his business, his definition of meaningful contribution. I want to stay here. I want to continue my work at the bakery. I want to build on what I've started, instead of abandoning it to return to a life that nearly suffocated me. His expression shifted from attempted understanding to barely controlled frustration. Work at the bakery, Vera, Be serious. You're a college-educated woman with sophisticated tastes and social connections. You're talking about throwing all of that away to be a shop clerk in a town no one's ever heard of. I'm talking about using my education and skills to do work that fulfills me instead of work that serves your image. I'm not a shop clerk, Marcus. I'm a partner in a successful artisan bakery. I design custom cakes, develop new recipes, manage holiday production schedules. People depend on my expertise and value my contributions. People who don't know any better might be impressed by your little hobby, but what happens when the novelty wears off? When you realize that this provincial life can't offer you the opportunities and experiences you're accustomed to. His inability to recognize my work as legitimate, even when confronted with evidence of my competence and satisfaction, finally convinced me that he would never see me as anything more than an extension of his own needs and ambitions. Marcus, I want a divorce, not because I'm confused or hormonal or going through a phase, but because I've finally understood that we want fundamentally different things from marriage. You want a supportive wife who enhances your life without complicating it. I want a partner who values my individual growth as much as our shared success. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of irreconcilable differences finally acknowledged. Marcus sat back against the sofa cushions, his confident demeanor cracking to reveal the wounded ego beneath. After everything I've given you, everything we've built together, you're going to throw it all away for this. He gestured dismissively around the cottage. For these people who don't even know you, these people see me more clearly than you have in years. They value my skills, respect my opinions and support my growth instead of trying to contain it. His mask of reasonable concern finally slipped completely, revealing the anger and control that had always lurked beneath his charm. Fine, if you want to destroy our marriage for some romantic fantasy about artisan baking, that's your choice. But don't expect me to make it easy. I'll fight the divorce, Vera. I'll make sure you get exactly what you're asking for, complete independence, with all the financial insecurity that entails. The threat was designed to terrify me back into compliance, but it landed like a promise of freedom. Good. I'd rather struggle doing work I love than live comfortably doing nothing that matters. He stood abruptly, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the cottage's humble warmth. You'll regret this, Vera. When you're working yourself to death for minimum wage while your friends from Ashford Heights are enjoying the benefits of sensible marriages, you'll remember what you gave up. After he left, slamming the cottage door with enough force to rattle the windows, I sat in the sudden quiet and marveled at how different this confrontation had felt from every argument we'd had during our marriage. For 20 years his anger had sent me scrambling to repair whatever I'd done wrong, to smooth over the disruption my needs had caused in his perfectly ordered world. Today his fury had simply confirmed that I was finally making choices based on my own values, rather than his comfort. The phone rang within minutes, Delphine checking on me with the intuitive timing that marked true friendship. How did it go, ma chérie? He's gone. It's over. I mean, really over. We're getting divorced. And how do you feel? I walked to the cottage window and looked out at the harbor where fishing boats were returning, with the day's catch, their lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. I feel free, terrified and free and more myself than I've been in 20 years. Then you are ready for what comes next. What comes next? Building the life you want instead of escaping the life you didn't. It is harder work, but much more satisfying. That evening, I joined the weekly gathering at the Weathered Anchor, where locals shared stories and opinions over Bastien's excellent fish stew. Word of Marcus's visit had spread through Port Evangeline's efficient communication network, and I found myself surrounded by quiet support that required no explanations or justification. Divorce is hard work, observed Ruth, my landlord, who'd been through her own difficult separation years earlier. But staying in the wrong marriage is harder. As Adora raised her glass of local wine in a toast that encompassed the entire table. To Vera, who chose courage over comfort, the simple declaration brought tears to my eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. I'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being needed, between partnership and performance, between compromise and capitulation. Marcus had driven to Port Evangeline expecting to collect a wayward wife who'd learned her lesson about independence. Instead, he'd encountered a woman who'd learned her worth. As winter deepened and the holiday season reached its peak intensity, I threw myself into the work at La Lune with renewed purpose. Each perfectly laminated croissant, each artfully decorated cake, each loaf of bread that emerged golden and fragrant from the oven was a small declaration of independence. I was building something with my own hands, earning respect through my own efforts, creating value that belonged entirely to me. The divorce proceedings would be complicated and probably ugly, but I faced them with resources Marcus had never believed I possessed: financial independence, meaningful work, and a community that valued me for who I was rather than who I could be molded into becoming. For the first time in 20 years, the future felt like a canvas waiting for my own creative vision rather than a script written by someone else. Standing in the bakery's warm kitchen as snow fell outside and the ovens filled the air with the scent of rising bread, I finally understood what Delphine had meant about building rather than escaping. This wasn't just the end of my marriage to Mark, it was the beginning of my marriage to myself, a partnership based on respect, growth, and the radical belief that my dreams deserved as much consideration as anyone else's. Spring arrived in Port Evangeline with the drama of a curtain rising on a new act. Ice retreated from the harbor, revealing waters that sparkled with reflected sunlight and promise. Lobster boats emerged from winter storage, their bright hulls a cheerful contrast to the weathered gray of the dock. The town itself seemed to stretch and wake after months of hibernation, with shop owners polishing windows and restaurant patios being prepared for the season's first brave diner. I stood on the cottage deck with my morning coffee, watching this annual resurrection while reflecting on my own transformation over the past 8 months. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, the legal dissolution of my marriage, surprisingly swift once Marcus realized I wouldn't be intimidated into reconciliation. He'd attempted one final manipulation through his lawyer, offering a generous settlement in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing our marriage publicly. The implication that I might damage his reputation by telling the truth about our relationship was so quintessentially Marcus that I'd actually laughed before declining. The financial settlement was modest but fair enough to provide security while I continued building my new life. Marcus had been forced to acknowledge that 20 years of unpaid labor managing his household and social obligations deserved compensation, though his lawyer had framed it as alimony rather than recognition of my contribution. The semantics mattered less than the reality. I was truly independent for the first time since college. La Lune had thrived through the tourist season's lull, sustained by loyal local customers and the growing reputation that drew food enthusiasts from Portland and Boston. My partnership with Delphine and Henry had evolved into something more substantial than any of us had initially envisioned. We'd expanded our offerings to include cooking classes for visitors, specialty catering for local events, and a small wholesale operation that supplied artisan breads to restaurants throughout coastal Maine. The success felt different from anything I'd experienced during my marriage. This wasn't reflected glory or vicarious achievement. It was the satisfaction of building something valuable through my own skills and dedication. Every positive review, every repeat customer, every moment when someone bit into something I'd created and smiled with genuine pleasure. These victories belonged entirely to me. Cordelia Thorne, the lawyer who'd handled my divorce with fierce competence, had become an unexpected friend. Over wine at the Weathered Anchor the previous evening, she'd shared observations about the transformation she'd witnessed in me during the legal proceeding. When you first walked into my office, you apologized for taking up my time before you even explained why you were there, she'd said, swirling her glass thoughtfully. You spoke about your marriage like you were defending a thesis you didn't quite believe. Now you talk about your bakery work with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what she's accomplished. Her words had resonated through the night and into this morning as I prepared for what would be the most significant day since Marcus's departure. Today I was meeting with a food writer from Down East magazine, who'd heard about La Lune through the restaurant network and wanted to feature us in an article about Maine's artisan food. More importantly, today I was finally ready to take the step I'd been contemplating for months, proposing an expansion that would establish my own distinct identity within our partnership. The magazine interview went better than I'd dared to hope. Sarah Chen was a thoughtful journalist who understood that great food stories were ultimately human stories. She spent the morning observing our production process, asking insightful questions about technique and philosophy, and sampling everything from our classic baguettes to my innovative lavender honey scones. "What drew you to traditional French method?" she asked as I demonstrated the proper folding technique for croissant dough. "The respect for process over speed," I replied, feeling Henry's approving nod from across the kitchen. "In our culture, we've become obsessed with efficiency and shortcuts. But some things can't be rushed without losing their essential character. Bread teaches you patience, attention, the value of allowing natural processes to unfold at their own pace." That sounds like a philosophy that extends beyond baking. It is. I spent 20 years trying to force myself into shapes that weren't natural to who I am. Coming here, learning these traditional methods, reminded me that growth happens gradually, through consistent practice and patience with the process. The photographer captured images of my hands shaping dough, the golden interior of a perfectly baked loaf, the moment when Henry and I collaborated on assembling a complex wedding cake that combined his architectural precision with my decorative artistry. These pictures would represent not just the bakery's work, but the culmination of my journey from invisible housewife to recognized artisan. After the magazine team departed, Delphine, Henry, and I gathered in the bakery's small office to discuss the proposal I'd been developing for weeks. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the folder containing business plans, financial projections, and architectural sketches. "I want to expand into specialty desserts and celebration cakes," I began, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. "Not just wedding cakes, but elaborate creations for significant anniversaries, milestone birthdays, corporate events, the kind of work that requires advanced techniques and commands premium pricing." Henry studied the sketches I'd prepared, detailed drawings of multi-tiered cakes that incorporated sugarwork, chocolate sculpture, and artistic elements inspired by my friendship with Isadora. "These are ambitious designs. You have confidence in your ability to execute such complexity." "I have confidence in my ability to learn whatever I need to know. And I have teachers who've shown me that mastery comes through practice, not perfection on the first attempt." Delphine examined the financial projections with the sharp eye of someone who'd built a successful business from nothing. "The startup costs are significant: new equipment, specialized ingredients, additional workspace. How do you propose to finance this expansion?" "Combination of my divorce settlement and a small business loan. I've already spoken with the bank, and they're willing to extend credit based on our current success and my detailed business plan." I paused, gathering courage for the most important part of my proposal. "I want to do this as a separate but connected entity, Vera's Confections, operating out of expanded space next door, in partnership with La Lune, but with its own identity and revenue stream." The silence that followed was heavy with consideration rather than judgment. Henry and Delphine exchanged a long look that spoke of 30 years of shared decision-making, wordless communication that I envied and hoped to find someday in my own relationships. "You want independence within partnership," Delphine finally said. "Your own domain, your own reputation, your own success or failure." "Yes, I've learned that I need to stand on my own accomplishments, not because I don't value what we've built together, but because I need to know that my success belongs to me." Henry smiled with the pride of a teacher watching a student surpass expectations. "This is good, healthy. The baker who cannot stand alone cannot truly collaborate. When do you want to begin?" Their approval unleashed excitement I'd been keeping carefully contained during months of planning. Within weeks, contractors were renovating the space next to La Lune, installing the specialized ovens and refrigeration systems that would allow me to create the elaborate confections I'd been dreaming about. Isadora designed a logo that combined elegant typography with subtle artistic elements that reflected both my culinary focus and our friendship. The first major order came sooner than expected, a golden anniversary celebration for a prominent Portland family who wanted something spectacular enough to mark 50 years of marriage. The commission challenged every skill I'd developed, requiring me to create a cake that told their love story through edible art. I spent days perfecting sugar flowers that matched the bride's original bouquet, practicing piping techniques that would reproduce the lace pattern from her wedding dress, developing flavor combinations that honored both their German heritage and their shared love of coastal Maine. The work consumed me completely, demanding the kind of focused attention I hadn't experienced since my art history studies in college. The night before the anniversary party, I stood in my expanded workspace surrounded by components that would become tomorrow's masterpiece. Each element had been crafted with obsessive attention to detail: delicate sugar roses that looked ready to release perfume, hand-painted fondant panels that recreated scenes from the couple's honeymoon travel, architectural buttercream work that suggested the Victorian home where they'd raised their children. Delphine found me there past midnight, still adjusting details that probably no one but me would notice. "Ma chérie, the cake is magnificent. You must trust your work and rest before tomorrow's assembly. I keep thinking I should add something else, make it more elaborate, more impressive. More is not always better. Sometimes perfection comes from knowing when to stop, when the work has achieved its purpose." Her wisdom echoed Henri's bread philosophy: respect for natural timing, trust in developed skills, confidence in quality over quantity. I stepped back from the cake components and saw them through her eyes. They were beautiful, technically accomplished, and deeply personal in ways that honored both the couple's story and my own artistic vision. The anniversary celebration exceeded every expectation. The cake became the centerpiece of an evening that celebrated not just the couple's enduring love, but the power of craftsmanship to mark life's most meaningful moment. Guests photographed every angle, several asked for my business card, and the anniversary couple themselves were moved to tears by the edible recreation of their shared history. But the most significant moment came when the bride, now 72, and still radiant in her husband's gaze, pulled me aside as the evening wound down. "Dear, this cake tells our story better than any words could. You've given us something we'll remember forever." She paused, studying my face with the insight that comes from decades of observing human nature. "More importantly, you've clearly found your calling. There's nothing more beautiful than watching someone do exactly what they were meant to do." Her words followed me home to the cottage, where I sat on the deck with a glass of wine and watched stars emerge over the harbor. 1 year ago I'd been a woman so lost in her husband's expectations that she couldn't remember her own dream. Tonight, I was an artist whose work had moved people to tears, an entrepreneur building something valuable and lasting, a woman who'd fought for her right to define her own worth. The anniversary cake became a turning point for Vera's confection. Word spread through Portland's social networks, generating inquiries that challenged me to constantly expand my capability. I created a gravity-defying sculpture cake for a modern art gallery opening, a whimsical children's birthday cake that incorporated edible fairy houses, a minimalist wedding cake that relied on perfect proportions and subtle flavor combinations rather than elaborate decoration. Each commission taught me something new about my own capabilities and artistic vision. I discovered that my greatest strength lay not in reproducing traditional designs, but in creating contemporary interpretations that honored classic techniques while expressing thoroughly modern sensibility. My cakes began appearing in food magazines and social media feeds, building a reputation that extended far beyond Port Evangeline. The financial success allowed me to make improvements to the cottage that transformed it from temporary refuge to permanent sanctuary. I installed a professional-grade kitchen that enabled me to test recipes and techniques at home, created a studio space where I could sketch designs and experiment with decorative elements, and established a garden where I grew edible flowers and herbs that appeared in my confection. More importantly, I'd built a life that felt authentically mine. My days followed rhythms I'd chosen, filled with work that challenged and fulfilled me, surrounded by people who valued my thoughts and contributions. The woman who'd once apologized for having preferences now stated her opinions with confidence, made decisions based on her own judgment, and took pride in accomplishments that belonged entirely to her. Rebecca visited during the height of summer tourist season, her first trip to Maine in the 2 years since my divorce. She arrived carrying preconceptions about my phase, and expecting to find me either defiantly defensive or quietly regretting my choices. Instead, she found her sister more vibrant and confident than she'd been since college. "You look like yourself again," she observed as we walked through downtown Port Evangeline, past shops where everyone greeted me by name and inquired about upcoming projects. "I'd forgotten how you used to light up when you talked about something you were passionate about," I'd forgotten too. I spent so many years dampening my enthusiasm to avoid overwhelming Marcus, that I almost convinced myself I didn't have any real passions left. We stopped at Vera's Confections, now fully established in its expanded space with a display case that showcased my latest creations. Rebecca studied the elaborate cakes and delicate pastries with genuine amazement. "These are incredible, Vera, museum quality incredible. How did you develop this level of skill so quickly?" It wasn't quick, it was 20 years in the making, even though I didn't realize it at the time. Every dinner party I planned, every elaborate dessert I made for Marcus's business functions, every technique I mastered to impress his colleagues, all of that was practice for this. I just didn't have the confidence to call it professional expertise until Delphine and Henry convinced me to trust my ability. That evening, we attended the weekly community gathering at the Weathered Anchor, where Rebecca witnessed firsthand the respect and affection I'd earned in Port Evangeline. Lobster fishermen asked my opinion on the best wine pairings for their cat. The librarian commissioned a cake for her daughter's graduation. The mayor discussed featuring my work in the town's tourism promotion materials. "This is what you needed all along," Rebecca said, as we walked back to the cottage under stars that seemed brighter than any I remembered from our childhood. "Not just independence but recognition, people who see your worth and aren't threatened by your success." Her observation crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated. The problem with my marriage hadn't just been Marcus's control, it had been the fundamental incompatibility between his need to be the star of our shared story and my need to be valued as a full person with my own talents and ambition. Here in Port Evangeline, I'd found what had been missing, a community that celebrated individual achievement without seeing it as competition. 6 months after Rebecca's visit, I received an unexpected phone call that brought my past and present into sharp focus. Marcus was getting married, his assistant informed me with professional courtesy, to a woman 20 years younger who worked in his firm's marketing department. The wedding would be featured in Ashford Heights society pages, a lavish affair that would restore his reputation as a desirable partner after the embarrassment of our divorce. I felt nothing but relief at the news. Marcus had found someone new to manage his image and accommodate his ego, someone young enough to believe that supporting his ambitions was the same as sharing his life. I genuinely hoped she would find happiness in roles I'd outgrown, though I suspected she would eventually face the same choice between self-preservation and self-erasure that had driven me to Port Evangeline. The call prompted me to update my own social media presence for the first time since leaving Ashford Heights. I posted photos of my latest cake creations, my cottage garden in full bloom, the view from my deck at sunset. Within hours, former acquaintances were commenting with surprise and admiration, several requesting information about commissioning work for their own celebrations. The responses revealed how thoroughly my old social circle had misunderstood my departure from Marcus. They'd assumed I was struggling to survive without his support, probably living in reduced circumstances while nursing regrets about my impulsive decision. Instead, they found evidence of a thriving business, artistic achievement, and obvious contentment that challenged their assumptions about the necessity of traditional marriage for women's happiness. Standing in my kitchen that evening, reviewing orders for the upcoming wedding season while bread rose for tomorrow's farmer's market, I marveled at the distance I'd traveled from the woman who'd sat silent through her anniversary dinner, while her husband publicly dismissed her work. That woman had believed she needed permission to pursue her dreams, validation from others to justify her choices, security from marriage to protect her from life's uncertainties. This woman knew better. She'd learned that permission was something you gave yourself, that validation came from competence and integrity rather than others' approval, that true security grew from developing skills and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than dependence. The anniversary of that devastating dinner arrived on a perfect spring evening, when the harbor sparkled with reflected lights and the air carried the scent of blooming lilacs. Instead of marking the day with sadness or anger, I celebrated it as the beginning of my real life. I prepared a feast for one: fresh bread from Henry's ovens, lobster from Bastian's boat, strawberry tart made with fruit from my own garden, wine from a local vineyard that had become a friend through our farmers market collaboration. As I raised my glass to toast my own courage, I understood finally what Delphine had meant about building rather than escaping. I hadn't just left Marcus, I'd created something beautiful in his absence. I hadn't just survived divorce, I'd thrived in independence. I hadn't just found work, I'd discovered my calling. The woman Marcus had dismissed as just a housewife had become an accomplished artisan, respected business owner, and valued community member. She'd learned that the greatest revenge against those who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, it's proving yourself right, building a life so fulfilling that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Sometimes the cruelest words become the greatest gifts, not because they don't hurt, but because they finally force you to stop accepting less than you deserve. Marcus had meant to diminish me with his casual dismissal, to remind me of my place in his carefully ordered world. Instead, he'd accidentally set me free to discover that my place was wherever I chose to stand, doing work that mattered to me, surrounded by people who celebrated rather than merely tolerated my success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.